Hi, I'm Old Norse specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford. I want to talk to you about some Norse gods that are quote unquote fake. Now, I could mean a lot of different things by that, so let me tell you what I mean by it. I mean beings that there is some historical basis for talking about, but which I never talk about because they're not mentioned or are barely mentioned, maybe, in our real Norse sources. Our real sources, books such as the Poetic Edda, translated by me and coming out in the second edition this year, and the Prose Edda, my translation should appear late next year, are full of important gods like Thor, Odin, Freya, Loki, and a lot of what you can find about Norse gods online mentions numerous other gods that really don't come forward in the Eddas. That's what I want to talk about with videos like this one. So in this video, I want to talk about Sinhtgunt. Exactly how to pronounce that is actually kind of an interesting question. To begin with, this being is not mentioned in any Old Norse language text. She is not mentioned in any Scandinavian text. Rather, she comes from the second Merseburg charm. Now, the Merseburg charms are preserved in Old High German, actually a fairly Old Saxon influence, Old High German. By Old Saxon, I mean the language of further northern Germany. By Old High German, I mean southern Germany. And they are fascinating, important documents for understanding the significance of the pre-Christian gods in Germany. For example, we find that there are, unsurprisingly, pre-Christian gods with the same names, mutatis mutandis, in Old High German as they are in Old Norse. So we have in Old High German Wotan or Wotan, like Old Norse Odin or Old English Woden. We have Balder mentioned in the second Merseburg charm as well. We have Freya mentioned in the second Merseburg charm as well, which is cognate with Old Norse Frigg, not with Old Norse Freya, incidentally. You would expect the vowel to be au if it were cognate with Old Norse Freya. The word that's cognate with Old Norse Freya is actually German Frau, right, like woman, lady. So how does Sinhtgunt come into this? She's mentioned in the second Merseburg charm with these words. Let me quote them to you. Thu begwol en Sinhtgunt Sunna era swister. So then Sinhtgunt cast a spell, Sunna's sister. Okay, now Sunna means the sun. There is also a fairly popular misunderstanding that this is a Norse goddess. I'll address that elsewhere because there's some interesting questions about that. But who on earth is Sinhtgunt? Now, in most accounts of this that you're going to find online, you're going to see this name spelled Sinthgunt. So you might already think that I'm misspelling it. But in fact, in the manuscript, it is Sinhtgunt, and there's no guarantee that that's not the right spelling, given that it's actually kind of hard to tell what this word is. There is no similar name of a goddess recorded in Scandinavia, right? We get no similar named goddesses in the Edda, but she's the sister of Sunna, so she is going to be a woman. Now, Gunt, what would we expect that to mean? Most likely, this has something to do with the feminine word that becomes Old Norse Gunnar or Gudr, meaning battle or war. That is very, very common in women's names. In its Old Norse form, Hildegun, for example, a woman's name, just means battle, battle, or simply Gunnar means battle. It's a woman's name. Gunnar is a man's name with the A in the second syllable. So it's probably that. That word doesn't typically occur on its own in Old High German, where it's Gunda on its own. It mostly occurs in names, so none of that contradicts the idea that that's what this word is. Standing on melting snow. All right, but what about the first part? That one is really, really tough. Sufus Bugge, an important researcher of Norse mythology 144 years ago, Suspected in a book old enough to be written in Fraktur that the only feasible etymology here is the one based on the manuscript spelling. To translate his Dano-Norwegian, he says, quote, "The war maiden who wanders night after night, who always wanders at night," off quote. That is very wordy as a translation, but I think that he's on to something. He takes that Sint as coming from Sinnacht, which would then be cognate with Old English Sinnicht, which means everlasting night. Now, this occurs in Old English as Sinnicht, and in Old Saxon as almost the same thing, Sinnachte, in talking about hell. For example, one of the Old English citations we see in the Bosworth-Taller Dictionary is "He abide on Sheolan in Sinnechte." People in hell, they will abide forever in the eternal night. We also have this prefix occurring in Old High German, so we know it exists there, in Sinthgroni, meaning evergreen. Our Old Norse si, like in si degris, every day, all day. So presumably something like all night, every night battle. Now, I don't know that that gets us closer to understanding who she is in the mind of the Old High German poet composing the second Merseburg charm, but I think that it's a pretty intriguing name. Presumably, since she's the son of she's Sun's sister, the sister of Sun, the heavenly body, not of S-O-N, S-U-N. She is something to do with the night sky. So is she a star? Is she the moon? Something like this, or somehow in control of stars or the moon or other nocturnal things? Is she a goddess associated with owls, right? There could be all kinds of things in her backstory there, and I suspect that this is a real, legitimate part of early pre-Christian German mythology. But even though German, English, and Norse are all closely related languages, we cannot assume that every single god and goddess, especially the less significant ones in narratives, right, less significant than your Odins and Thors and Lokis, would be shared by all of these different people. So this could be a figure who never came to prominence in the North or was forgotten in the North but retained in memory in some places in the South. At any rate, she's not found in the Eddas, whatever exactly the story behind her and her name is. Come back and talk about Sunna 2. Let me just tell you a little bit about my friends and partners at Grimfrost and about my own current projects. So first of all, if you are really into Old Norse products, including my own books or very historically accurate reproductions of Norse jewelry, such as the Thor's hammer pendants, or Norse weapons, or Norse board games, or just cool t-shirts with neat designs, sometimes done by me in runes. The people that you should turn to are the people at Grimfrost. They're good friends of mine. They helped sponsor my great trip to Sweden in 2022 when I visited and made videos about some of the most important runestones there. Check them out and let them know that I sent you. Second, let me tell you a little bit about my projects. My Wanderer's Journal, which will be a blank journal, like this, but cooler, although this one's pretty cool. My brother gave it to me. It will have quotes from Hávamál in Old Norse, rendered by me in Viking Age accurate Younger Futhark, and then rendered artistically by Hackett's Liz Wilson, and then also the Cowboy Hávamál translations of those. The second edition of my Poetic Edda translation will be out probably by the end of 2025. It will include some new translations, some translations of poems, including some that have never been translated into a language other than Old Norse before. And then the Prose Edda should be due probably by the end of 2026. All right, back to our main programming. Now, Sunna, who is mentioned in that poem, her name means sun, right? This is the word that is going to become modern High German Zona, die Zona. And of course, it's very, very close to the word that becomes English sun. Notice that in Old Norse, the word for sun is sol, right? So it ends in L rather than the root ending in N as it does in German and English. What is going on with that? Well, not to turn this into purely a linguistics video, but This probably is related to what we call the heteroclitic nouns in Anatolian languages, like Hittite, special focus of my good friend and colleague, Professor Tony Yates. These heteroclitic nouns have an R at the end of the root in the nominative, in other words, when the noun is the subject, and an N at the end of the root when it's not. So, for example, water, the Hittite word is in fact watar. You can tell in this language that's thousands of years old and spoken a long way from English that it is related to English. But then you have witten is the form of the water root in other cases. For example, something like wittenas, genitive, like of the water, waters, apostrophe S. So what's happened is heteroclitic nouns probably were a feature of Proto-Indo-European, the common ancestor of Hittite, English, Norse, German, Persian, Sanskrit, Ukrainian, everything just about in Europe, India, and a lot of the places in between. But other than in Anatolian languages like Hittite, these were different languages would pick one or the other. So that English and German pick the R form of the water word, right? Water, Wasser. But then Old Norse picks the N form. Now, it's possible that there were also LN heteroclitic nouns, although there's a little bit less evidence for these. One of the few words that there's really a lot of evidence for this with is sun. But quite likely, in Proto-Indo-European, the nominative form of the word for sun is something like sehul, and then the form of the root in other cases is like sehun. And so English has and German have picked the form with the N from the oblique cases. Latin sol, Old Norse sol, Greek helios, that L form comes from the nominative. So if there were a goddess named Sun in Old Norse, her name would be Sol, not Sunna. Although, asterisk, Sunna does occur in poetry in Old Norse as a poetic word for the sun. It does not occur with reference to a goddess of the sun, though. So it's interesting that the Norse poets actually do remember this other form of the word, even though it's not the normal form of the word in their own language. In Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, we get a really involved story about the sun and the moon and how they are sort of both a god in the case of Mani the moon, a goddess in the case of Sol the sun, and lights in the sky. But in most of the poems of the Poetic Edda, aside from maybe a very vague reference in Vafthrudnismal, the sun and the moon are things. They're sparks from Muspelheimr, the fiery realm at the beginning. They are not living beings. And so I think probably, although Snorri's story involving all these names, Simul and Huki and Bill, it's probably an old story, but it's probably a story that kind of existed alongside the canon of what becomes our Eddic mythology. Think about the way that in modern English, we can talk really, really inconsistently about the moon too, right? Depending on context, you might refer to the moon. If you're inclined toward like Greek mythology, you might talk about Artemis up in the sky, or Diana if you prefer the Roman name, right? And that's female. If you're inclined toward just kind of old-fashioned English-speaking folklore, you might talk about the man in the moon. So that contradicts the Diana or Artemis term. If you're scientifically inclined, you talk about a rock that orbits the Earth. There's probably something about this. It's not quite scientifically right to say, but you know what I mean. Or you talk about how it's made of cheese if you're otherwise inclined. There's a lot of different folklores about the moon. There are even people who think the moon doesn't exist. That's an interesting thing about weird ideas that spread on the internet. But at any rate, there's lots of contrary ideas about it, and probably in early Germanic-speaking societies and in Old Norse society too, there's different folklore about it. And our sort of high-level, from a medieval perspective, like the highbrow mythology doesn't seem to have an active sun and moon goddess. It seems the sun and the moon are just sort of things, but that there may be a kind of folkloric element still preserved there distantly in Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda of a story about the sun and the moon being beings, people. It just really doesn't seem to be how they're ever talked about. You know, they're not talked about that in Völuspá and Hávamál. the poems about the gods really don't talk about them. You never see sun and moon, Sol or Sunna, or Moni sitting at banquets of the gods when all the gods come together, like in Lakasana, or at the beginning of even Snorresulson's Skoldskaparmol. So this is a case where, yeah, there's a sun, which might be a being. If it is a being, her Old Norse name is Sol, and it's a woman, which sometimes I've seen people get confused about before, rather than Sunna. Sunna is the Old High German name, and I don't think it's likely that they were major personalities in the in the mythological stories involving Odin, Thor, and Loki. All right, this is a little bit about Sinhtgunt and Sunna. Check out my Mersburg Charms video if you want to hear more about that actual source itself. Look for more videos on my channel about thousands, literally thousands of topics in Norse language, myth, runes, etc., as well as just broader Indo-European and Germanic linguistics. And for now, from beautiful Jackson County in beautiful Colorado, I'm wishing you all the best.
Very windy filming day. So I am hanging out in the truck, enjoying this beautiful view. Absolutely stunning. The professor is hardy. He is out there in the wind filming, and I gave him toe warmers. So that's about all he needs, though. He's pretty tough. Much tougher than me.